welcome to everybody. My name is Carlos Cordon. I'm a professor at IMD. I've been a professor for maybe too many years. And I'm a professor of strategy and supply chain management. And what we are going to look today is basically something that has been on the news again and again over the last 2 years, which is all the disruptions that we have in the supply chain and how companies have reacted to become resilient and how they are able to supply or not to supply. And that's something that I would say some people would say is basics. I won't suggest that. I have a lot of discussions with a lot of people with a lot of experience, executives in supply chain, and it's not obvious even for them how to manage the situation, how to increase the resilience. And even it's a discussion that right now is going on at the board level. And some boards are asking, can we do a supply chain resilience test? Can we test how resilient is our supply chain? The same way that there is a stress test for banks, for financial institutions, is there a stress test for supply chain in order to be able to test the resilience? So what we're going to do in this webinar, we're going to look at where is this coming from? What are the challenges? In particular, we're going to use a lot of the news, the recent news, trying to understand what's going on and trying to see what companies are doing to face that. For some of you who are experienced in supply chain, you might say, well, this is a little bit basic. Well, the basics is where we are failing. And actually, my argument is going to be that we have taken for granted so many things for so many decades because supply chain people did a very good job, that now we are confronted to something that honestly is new and at the same time is not clear how to deal with. So allow me to do that. And I will ask you a couple of questions during the webinar, and I hope that you will put the answer in Zoom. So a little bit what I want to talk is that supply chain, the future is different from the past. It sounds a little bit simplistic, but it's exactly what is happening. What has happened over the last 20 to 30 years in supply chain, where we have been working, is not where we are going to work over the future. It's a fundamental shift. And that is something that is challenging everybody because it means that what was good for the last 10, 20 years in supply chain is not what we need to do now. So I will start talking about what has happened, what has changed, and it's a fundamental change in the context affecting fundamentally supply chains. I will go to what I call the new weak links in the chain, and I will emphasize that several times. A supply chain is not the sum of the average, is the weakest link. So if you're in sales, you say, okay, so how much we sold of different products or so much, okay, one product sold more, one product sold less, therefore it balances. In supply chain is not the case. If there is one component, one thing that is failing, the whole supply chain collapses. That's something I will emphasize. And then I will go over some of the resilient levers. What are companies doing precisely to become more resilient? So the first thing is that supply chain people has become a hero all over the place. This was the country in New Zealand talking about COVID-19, that now we are almost in several parts of the world. We are forgetting about that, whereas in China it's becoming a big issue. And if you look at that, there was health, safety, social, and supply. And supply was a hero. It has saved a little bit the world during those times. It is true. And I always want to pay an homage and to say that supply chain people have been working a lot and have been doing things that was not what we expected to do, much more than what was expected, with a lot of dedication and making sure that the supply chains were moving. Then these are the news, and these are the news of actually, if I recall that correctly, yesterday and today, the last 24 hours. There was CBS saying product shortages and soaring prices reveal the fragility of the US supply chain. That's the US, you can apply that to all over the world. Toyota saying that they are planning a 10% production cut in May because of supply chain disruptions. That news, if you look at the date, it says 13th of April, 2022, so it was yesterday. And right now, what is happening, that was 1 month ago, China was basically, because of the COVID-19 zero tolerance policy, they were shutting down basically Shenzhen. That was 1 month ago. Now, if you read the news, they are having a lot of challenges in Shanghai. And if the port of Shanghai, which is one of the busiest ports in the world, shuts down, we are going to have problems all over the supply chains. So it's all over the place. It's happening. It's constant news. And I should also add that as a supply chain professor, I've been asked in the last, I would say, 18 months, much more than ever before, by journalists, by TV, by radio, everybody to comment on that. So that's what is happening. But it's even more than that. This is in the top, you see something which is interesting. If you want to buy a car, good luck. This is typically, that building is full of cars. The car lot was full typically of cars to be sold. And in the US, basically they don't do like in Europe, in which we order the car and they manufacture it specifically for you. You buy the car out of the parking lot. Now, some car dealers in the US, they were complaining because customers were not even stopping because they thought they were out of business. There are no cars in your parking lot, in your car lot. And they said, yeah, we sold all of them. So there is a lot of problems. The one down right is a picture taken 2 days ago in a supermarket in France. There is not sunflower oil. So there's shortages of that sunflower oil because, as you know, of the crisis and the war in Ukraine. So that means basically that we are having a lot of challenges that is affecting us every day as consumers. And so what is it? Well, is Ukraine, is COVID-19, is the lack of truck drivers. It's interesting, when Brexit happened, you might remember, those of you in the UK, that a few months ago, there was a big problem because there was no truck drivers, enough lorry drivers, as you say in the UK, to drive the products to the supermarkets. The products were there, but we couldn't distribute them. On top of that, there is two things that I want to emphasize. There is something which in supply chain happens, which is the domino effect. The domino effect means, for example, if you are, and I will use the example of car manufacturers, if you're a car manufacturer and you cannot make the car because there is no microchips, it means that all of the other suppliers, the suppliers of tires, the suppliers of seats, they should also stop. So you could say, I'm a supplier of tires for the car industry. I don't have any shortage. However, I need to stop because my customer cannot make cars because there's another component that is lacking. So the problem with supply chain is that it propagates. And then the bullwhip effect is an effect, I won't go over details now, but it's an effect, think about that, how things get distorted. And one of the things that happens is what many people call panic buying. Suddenly, all of us, we're buying to buy something. You remember the toilet paper at the beginning of the COVID-19. Now, the usage of toilet paper was stable, but people got panic, and then suddenly everybody was buying. There was a lack of paper, of toilet paper. Now, what this means? This means that we used to operate in a very stable world. For the last 20, 30 years, it was very rare that we will not have a supply of something. It was the other way around. It was a world in which we were planning ahead. We were saying, what do we need to do? Things were relatively stable. Yes, we talk about the VUCA world, this acronym of volatile, uncertainty. Yes, but it was in the supply world. It was a wall of stability. We planned for years. We negotiated every year the prices, even a 3-year plan. Things were stable. In the last 2 years, that hasn't happened. And many people were thinking, well, maybe after COVID goes out, after the vaccine and so on, then things will stabilize. Well, the bad news is that things are not going to stabilize in the near term. It's going to take a long time. Why is that? Precisely because what I said about the propagation effect and the effect of many people actually doing things in order to get resilient. So the fact that we are buying more is going to create the problem of lack of supply. Think about the following. You could imagine a manufacturer company like that makes margarine typical company like Unilever or any other food company. The consumption of margarine is very stable over the years. The production, therefore, is stable. We don't need to have much more production. But if now suddenly everybody says, we're going to buy more just in case, we're going to stock up, then suddenly there's surge in demand. And until the capacity keeps up with the demand, it's going to take a while. And if we continue to have bumps, that's going to perturbate. So to stabilize that, it's going to take quite a long time. So the challenges today for supply chain is the ability to get supplies. That's one. The ability to deliver. You might have the product, but you're not able to deliver. And we'll talk about some trade-offs that until now we didn't have. And the last sentence here says supply chain is very, very, very important. Probably is too obvious for you. Them saying that because it's so important, I'm going to argue that are we too much focused on the consumer and the customer? I say too much and not enough on the supply. Let me develop that argument. So we were so good in supply chain and logistics that these are some of the comments I got. I remember the CEO of a global FMCG, consumer good company, he told me literally in 2018, just 1 year before the pandemic, he said, my people in supply chain have done a great job. So much that he said, I believe there is not much more to squeeze. Because supply chain was about reducing cost. So the idea in supply chain was we deliver a service level of 90%, 95, 99, and minimize the cost. That was the simple thing. And even this is another quote from a VP of logistics in a transport company. He was telling me, Carlos, we are so tight about reducing costs that we talk about cents. We don't talk about euros or dollars. We talk about cents, how much we're going to do that. And also, we had the view that was absolutely amazing. We thought 4 years ago, if you read the news, if you remember the news at that time, that logistics was going to be the autonomous truck. And that article is an article that more than 5 years old, in which a journal was saying, wow, we are going to have a problem because self-driving trucks are coming, and we have 3.5 million truckers in America, in the US. How much do we have in other places? A lot. The reality today, we don't have enough truck drivers. We cannot deliver products because of that. So it's exactly the opposite of what we expected. So that was the world, a very stable world that has changed. And let me use a metaphor, which is not so much of a metaphor, it's a real example. I always say that we used to live in the McDonald's world. Why? Because we thought about customer centricity, trying to get consumer insights. What is what the consumer wants? Let's do customer research. Let's try to understand what they like, how they like it. And then we design the best menu for the consumers. McDonald's does that per country. They try to update that. It's a very critical decision. Once they have done that, using all the knowledge they can about consumers and customers, what do they do then? Operations. Operations is going to deliver that menu with 100% quality, 100% service level, and at optimized cost. That's the objective. And the goal was basically, let's increase market share and profitability by increasing the number of restaurants, reducing the cost. We do franchising. So that was it. That was the world in which we live. And that world assumes that we have all of the ingredients. So that means we are able to provide that. That's the world we used to live. Supply operations was there to supply what we design. What is the new world? The new world is the world of a chef. Think about one of these high class or simply a chef that is designing the menu based on what is available in the market, what's on season, what's fresh. So what's the job of the chef of that restaurant is to learn what customers like, consumers are going to like. Of course, she or he has that in mind, goes to the market, look at what is available, what is fresh, then thinks about this, I can buy this and I can make this dish. This is what I can offer my consumers. So they design the product, they deliver what is available, and they also select the supply. And many of you remember when you go to one of those restaurants, they say menu of the day. This is what today is available. And they specifically would recommend that because it's on season, the asparagus season and so on. So that's the new world in which we're going to live. And think about that, because that means, yes, we are still consumer and customer centric, but we are very focused on what is available. Let me use one example. This is McDonald's. Literally, this is I took this picture out of, and you will see there's some French words, so it's actually in Switzerland, in Lausanne. And this is what they offer. And you will see that the menu is going to be the same until they change it, maybe once a year, maybe sometimes they add something, they subtract something, but they don't change that based on availability of supplies because they assume it's going to be there. This is probably what is classified by many people as the best restaurant in the world. It's a restaurant in Copenhagen called Nomad. And what you see there is the menu. And the menu says from February 1st to June 4th, we offered you the menu, which is called the Ocean Season. Why? Because it's the season in the Baltics where they basically get all this fresh seafood. They don't even specify exactly what is in the menu because they are going to buy, they're going to see what is available, what is fresh, what is of good quality, and offer that to the customers. Very good companies, both. One is the best in the world, the other is one of the best-known fast food companies. It's not that one is better than the other. It's one assumes that the supply is there, the other doesn't. And we are going much more to this world in which not everything is available. And one very important thing is like a supply chain is as strong as its weakest link. And I'm saying that because everywhere else we do averages. How much we have sold? Well, let's try to see this division, or this product range, we average out. We don't look at the weakest one. Here we're looking at the weakest one. Lack of supply is one of the challenges that we're facing today. If there is no potatoes, you cannot do French fries. If there is no truck drivers, you cannot deliver. And that means you stop the whole thing. If there is no spare parts for machines in a McDonald's, you cannot offer the product. If there is lack of labor, and we'll put one example, you cannot deliver neither. If there is lack of energy, you cannot deliver. So the whole thing stops. Every one of those things, one of them fails, the whole thing stops. And that's what is very, very relevant about supply chain. Very small thing could stop it. Let me use one example. These are real examples. McDonald's basically was facing a shortage in French fries. So in Japan, actually, they even rationed the French fries in McDonald's. They didn't have it. So another one was similar to McDonald's again. Why? Because they face labor shortage because of the Omicron. So it was a few months ago. In different parts of the world, Omicron was making people logically to stay at home if they were infected. So as a consequence, these restaurants, they say, we cannot deliver. We don't have enough labor. And the last one is very, very specific to the UK. And yes, several firms, basically the haulage lorry drivers were not there, consequence of the Brexit. And as a consequence, we started not to be able to deliver. So any one of those things, and this is what is a supply chain, basically means we don't deliver. Is not averaging out again. But it's a world full of opportunities. And let me provide you some examples. If you look at the car industry, I use this as an example because people buy cars and something affects everybody. So the car industry, if you look at 2021 versus 2019, 2 years before the pandemic, it was before the pandemic, they have sold less cars. Why? Because there is not enough components. So the actual figures are 74.9 million cars in 2019 versus 66.7 million in 2021. However, one of the interesting things is that waiting times and prices have increased. So let me ask you one question, and I would like you to write that in the Zoom chat. What do you guess is the delay in getting a Porsche Taycan in the UK. And I say a Porsche Taycan because it's luxury, expensive car. So that means it's not going to be, so okay, 52 weeks, 5 months, 2 years, 9 months, 12 months, 10 months, 0, 2 years again, 1 year. Okay, let me tell you the answer. Many of you are right, but if you think of, you read all the answers, the maximum is 2 years that you have put. Actually, that's it. It's 2 years. So it's one of those things that you say, my goodness, when you see a waiting time like this, it means quite a lot of things. From a business perspective, well, you're poor, you will say, oh, I wish I could sell more, I could make more and sell more. Actually, they do it. If you want to buy a cheap one, and remember, Porsche is part of the Volkswagen group. So yeah, you see saying, I can't afford a Tesla, Porsche Taycan. That's right. You see, I'm sorry, I cannot afford that neither. But actually, if you think about buying maybe a Skoda, which is one of the cheap brands of the Volkswagen group, maybe there's not going to be a lot of availability because they are dedicating the microchips to the expensive cars that are more profitable. And let me put that way. This is the sales of GM for Volkswagen in 2021 versus 2019. I'm sorry because the display colors are not very good of the title. So basically, these three companies sold 20%, 21% less cars in 2021 than 2019. But they had 48% higher profits in 2021 than 2019. What has happened? Two things. One of the things is that first, they have increased prices. So actually, logically, there is the law of supply and demand, and well, the prices go up. So you see there that the profits of Ford, for example, 2019 was 6.4 billion, 2021, 18 billion. GM made in 2019 6.7 billion, in 2021, 10 billion. So yes, that's logic, it's business, supply and demand. They have made a much better job. But then I would raise another question, which is an interesting one. When I see a lot of increase in waiting times, that might mean that the prices are not high enough. So should have Porsche increase more the prices? Let me give you one example that is happening there. So in the US, where there are figures publicly available, it turns out that when you go to a dealer to buy a car, typically what happens is that you go there, there is a manufacturer recommended price. And that's the basis for negotiation about how much discount you give me. So if this car is $50,000, give me a discount and you negotiate that. Today is exactly the opposite. The car is $30,000. Oh, you want it? That's the recommended price. We, as a dealer, we sell that to you for $50,000. So you pay a markup in order to do that. So the ones who are capitalizing on this are the dealers. And that raises the question of, should companies have a much more agile pricing and increase prices even more? Let me use an example. If you talk to car companies, they will tell you that in general, they change the price once, 2 times, maximum 3 times per year. Tesla is doing that much more often. Why? Because they have a direct relation with consumers. So of course, they're increasing more often the prices. And that means that as an organization, as a company, we might need to put in place a pricing system that takes into account the supply and the demand, not only the consumer, not only what the consumer is willing to pay for it. My colleague, Stéphane Michel, for example, he says always there are 4 C's for prices. The first C is consumer. What is the consumer value? The second one is the cost. The third one is the competition. And the fourth one is constraints. The constraint in supply. Now, the constraint in supply almost never existed. Almost never existed. You couldn't get the car very fast, but it was not these waiting times. And in the case of the US, you will find the car in the dealership and you will buy it. So that's precisely what is happening right now. Yes, and the question is, don't go to cars, go to any other company. Have you raised the prices enough? Or Do you have enough agility in talking between supply and demand, marketing, product development, sales, and the supply chain to understand which one is the price that the market should be? Let me go further and then explain something which is very interesting. If you look at a car sold in 2021, the average profit per car is $2,500 in the case of the US for car manufacturers, not for dealers. The average cost of semiconductors in a car is $330. So you could say, wait a minute, do you mean that something that in total cost is $330? Because we don't have that. We are basically giving up $2,500 in profit. Why is that? Well, because traditionally in supply chain and procurement, the objective was let's obtain the cheapest components. So procurement people will negotiate as much as they can with the microchip suppliers in order to reduce the cost. Yes, that makes sense if we have enough supply. If we don't, then we are actually trading off how much do we save versus the possibility of losing $2,500 in profit. And let me explain you even further why is this very important. Because now if you go to the microchip suppliers, the semiconductor suppliers, they will tell you the following, which is interesting. They will tell you we have three divisions. I remember one of them, they had three divisions. One is consumer electronics, the semiconductors that go into your phone, into the computer, and so on. Good profits. Another is semiconductors for industry, relatively acceptable profits. And the last division is the automotive one. And the challenge for that manufacturer was, well, the profitability of the automotive division is so low that the board is wondering if we should close it because we need to invest in a new facility. You know that facilities for semiconductors, these microchips are around $1 billion each. And the question was, are we going to invest or the profits are so low that we don't want to invest? So by reducing the cost and putting pressure in becoming more efficient, we have made the business this not profitable for the semiconductor manufacturers. And as a consequence, we jeopardize the whole profit. So to save some money in the $300, we jeopardize potential profits of $2,500. Now, whereas this was not the case before, this is what is happening all over the place right now. Let me ask you one question, and that's a simple one. This is Merck's line. And by the way, don't try to Google that. But write in the Zoom chat by how much a company like Merck, which is a shipping line, has increased profits between 2018 to 2021. 5 times, 25%, 400. Wow, 200%, 10 times more, 1,000%, 50, 100, 30. Okay, sit down. There were some people saying 10 times more. Okay, sit down because I'm going to give you the answer and you will need to sit down. 50 times more. If you look at 2018, the profit was 400 million. You look at 2017, the profit was 400 million, also 406. Look at 2021, 19 billion, almost 20 billion. So what has happened there is like, oh my goodness. Remember, it was a few months ago when people were saying, we don't have enough containers, we cannot ship things, there is delays. This is supply and demand going on. So it's interesting because what a company like Merck had done, it typically used to be an industry, this is the profit between different years. And the profit was not very high and it was going up and down. But thanks to the COVID, they made a lot of profits. But growth is not there. It's an industry with a very low growth. So you don't see a lot of growth. Now, this back and up is basically for this. Now, Helen Parsons is asking if this 50%, 50 times more is sustainable. Absolutely. That's the right question, Helen, because it's not sustainable. So what are they doing? Well, Merck's, and then we have the two biggest competitors. On one side is Merck's, on the other side is MSC. Merck's is pursuing a strategy of acquisitions in the supply chain, vertical integration. They Their motto is, we want to manage from the factory to the sofa. So it's vertical integration. The idea is, let's try to make sure that we can provide this service. The other biggest company there is MSC. They are basically pursuing horizontal integration. They are acquiring more and more companies in shipping. So it's two totally different strategies. Now, which one is right? We'll see. The jury is still out. But the interesting thing is that if you look at the profits of Merck's, and I here compare in the left the profitability of Merck's, you see ups and downs. And in the right, you see the profitability of a typical logistic company like DHL. You see that profitability is much more stable. So you could infer that the strategy of Merck's is to go to something which is much more stable in profits and in profitability over the time to try to de-risk this. And this is why this was an interesting comment, somebody saying, is Amazon and Merck's going to collide in a fight for the world supply chain? It's a little bit extreme, but it gives you an idea of the strategy that Merck's is following and how that could influence. Now, the other interesting thing is that Merck's has gone, and I will emphasize that later on, they have gone from being a digital laggard, and maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you might remember years ago, they had a big IT breakdown, cyber attack, that I remember in the news, they were saying that the port of Rotterdam was stopped for 1 week because of that, the part that Merck's managed. To today, basically to be one of the leaders in digital. They have some of the platforms, they acquire some companies, and actually they have become one of the leaders in digital supply chains. Now, let me ask you one question. We were emphasizing several times that the weakest link is the one that basically determines the performance of the supply chain. Which one was the weakest link? This is the COVID vaccine. And you remember it was a lot of things. Blockchain, okay, glass, air fried, cooling, availability of silicon, glass, manufacturing capacity, packaging, distribution, cooling, coolers. Yeah, you remember containers, shipping, cooling. Oh. Now, let me tell you what I believe it was. There was a lot of things that you say are right because they were not, they're shingers. Yes, absolutely. You remember the idea of we have enough. So I have, my neighbor is in here at IMD, is a professor. She has a PhD in pharmacology. Staff says, Sebastian, absolutely. And she was asking me, Carlos, that was the end of 2019. She was telling me, Carlos, now that the vaccine is coming, the problem is going to be solved. And as a consequence, we'll go back to normal. And I remember I told her, I'm afraid not. We have a problem. The problem is the vials, the crystal vials. And she said, Carlos, what are you talking about? It doesn't make any sense. These people know what they're doing. Well, if you remember, there was a vial shortage. And if you remember, we ended up having 5 doses or 10 doses even of vaccines per vial. This is, from a safety point of view, is not very good. I mean, typically, when you have a vaccine, you have 1 per vial. You don't have several. And that was one of the, at that time, at the beginning, was the weakest link. Then the ones that you mentioned, the cooling devices. Do you remember at the beginning, minus 72 centigrades? There was not enough freezers. And then, yes, the stuff, as you mentioned, oh my goodness. So we ended up one after each other. As we start to make the supply chain to work, we find one after each other weak links. And all of them created basically a lot of trouble. So that basically shows that we have quite a lot of problems. I take the example of the vial shortage because it was probably the biggest one for me. But all the others that you mentioned were there and were constantly on the news. So how had companies increased the resilience? And these are a little bit some of the things that I will elaborate a little bit. These are the things they have seen that companies have done in order to increase the resilience. And I will go with one example in every one of those. And I will also pinpoint one that is what not to do. And some of you might say, Carlos, but I'm a lawyer. Contract is very important. That's important provided that you have a stability and everybody can comply. So let me go one by one. We will go talk about higher stocks, looking for alternative suppliers. I'm going to question the globalization drive. I don't think that globalization is going to end, as some people are saying, but I think that we are going to see much more regionalization. We're going also to see a lot of redesigning the product and the service. For the first time, again, as with pricing, we're going to see people in product development, in marketing and sales, talking to supply chain and need to work together. And this is important because we are not so much used to work together. It's more efficient that everyone does her or his own job without too many meetings. You know how many meetings we have that actually coordination requires an effort and is expensive. And the same with simplifying the offer to consumer. I remember I started to say, well, maybe we were too consumer-oriented. We should be consumer-oriented, but maybe we're too consumer-oriented and not enough supply-oriented. We'll see that digitalization is helping, but not in the way we expected. We'll talk about agility in a different way. And we will talk about collaborating across the ecosystem, even with competitors. So let me go one by one. So the first one is Toyota. So there was an outcry at the beginning of the pandemic with all the shortages, and everybody stopped factories. Everybody said, we don't have microchips, we cannot make cars. And surprise, surprise, Toyota is continuing to produce cars at the beginning. So the question was, how do they have microchips? There's a shortage. What's happening? Well, Toyota, many of you remember, they created the famous Toyota production system. And part of it was the idea of the just-in-time. Just have the components and the products that you need, no more than that. So minimize the stock. Stock is expensive, stock can get obsolete and so on. It was the idea of the Kanban cars and just-in-time. And what happens? We have this shortage, and what is Toyota doing? Well, it turns out that Toyota had asked suppliers to have 2 months of inventory of microchips, but they did that 10 years ago. So what happened, you remember in 2011, there was this unfortunate tsunami in Japan. So what was the learning for Toyota? They said the learning for us is if there is a disruption, in this case, there was a disruption in energy supply, they said what happens is that we end up having to stop the factories because we don't have microchips. So what they did in a very smart way, they said, we are not going to have components with microchips at our factories. We're going down to the source, and we are going to ask our suppliers, the ones who buy the microchips, to have 2 months of stock. Why 2 months? Because at that time, 2011, when the tsunami happened and the problem with the nuclear facility, the shortages of energy were basically there for 2 months. After 2 months was solved. So that's what kept them producing. After 2 months, of course, they faced the same shortages as everybody else. And that I show you, recently they say we are going to cut production. But the interesting thing is, yes, inventory might be a good thing, but you need to know where to have it and which inventory to have. So it's not something that let's have a lot of everything. And I'm saying that because you say, Carlos, this is obvious. Well, I'm finding, talking with a lot of supply chain managers, that they say, we are buying everything that we can find just in case. It tends not to work. So on the contrary, analyze why, where, and how, and who should have it. Now, I should add also that Toyota, they told their suppliers, we, Toyota, are going to pay for that because it's our safety. So that's the first thing. Yes, increase stock levels, but with surgical precision. The second one is looking for alternative suppliers. We see that now. Basically, this is the news from 2 days ago. Basically, Japan, logically, they are looking for alternative suppliers for coal. Now, interestingly enough, many companies over the years, whereas they had the policy of having more than one supplier for product or for services, over the years, we have started to have what many people call sole suppliers, only one. I remember a car manufacturer telling me, Carlos, we cannot have 2 suppliers. It would be too expensive for us. We are not big enough. Well, it's much more expensive if you cannot sell. And these are the trade-offs that before we didn't have in supply, in procurement. Now we have them for the first time. Another one is nearshoring. So these are, what I put here is basically the reasons why companies used to offshore. And one of the things that happened is that we used to have cost advantages in low-cost countries. You know that it's labor arbitrage. So labor in China or India is much cheaper than some other countries. We used to have a favorable regulation. So the regulation in some countries, particularly respect to environmental pollution, was much more relaxed. Availability of labor. You remember always people saying, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of engineers in India available for hire. Not millions, but thousands of them. And also what happened is that some companies were saying, the suppliers, because you're a new customer, they're so eager to partner with you, they're going to do all this. So that was why companies offshore 5-10 years ago. And even I remember writing cases about how to do it here at IMD. Now, the challenge we have today is that the risk is much higher than before. The risk of having only one global source becomes very high. The cost in these locations in China and India and so on is increasing. If you look at the cost of labor in China, they have multiplied by 2 in the last 10 years. Many of these countries, again, the example of China, they have increased the ecological, the environmental legislation. They're reaching the same levels as everybody else. So logically, they are going to not to have that advantage. And there's also a lot of consumer and political pressure to localize supply. So that's going to mean basically it's not local. This is my argument. It's much more regional. It's much more in the Americas, in Europe. And Europe is trying to use a lot supplies in Africa. Now, I'm not going to develop that, but this is a model I developed to think about decisions about nearshoring. 4 main elements. One is the total acquisition cost. Very important because companies, they realize that they were looking just at the cost of buying something. When they start to add all of the other costs, they realize, well, it's not so much cheaper anymore. The second and very important one is risks. So the risk of having the supply in a certain place or the risk of the supply going bankrupt, that leads basically to the idea of if I have something closer, probably I can manage better the risk. And then 2 other elements, differentiation, sustainability. Today, companies are not looking, or they were not looking so much at these 2 elements, but they are very important. The component inside is coming from where? And that consumers now, they're looking very much at the traceability. Where does this come from? Similarly, many consumers and customers are looking at sustainability. What is the environmental footprint? What about ESG and so on? So these 2 are that I would say 2-3 years ago, they were not so relevant. They have become much more relevant. So I will give that and you will get a copy of the slide. So this is a model that is being used. Another thing that companies have done is rethink the product. Now, the interesting thing is that here the first news says that Tesla actually rewrote the software. So what happened is that Tesla, they found out they didn't have enough chips, microchips, enough semiconductors. They asked their engineers, could you use these other semiconductors that are available and program there so we can do the same functions? So that's what the news is. Some of the other news about Tesla is, well, it looks like some of the cars that are being sold today they are not going to be able to have some of the future functions. So that means it's not clear, but does that mean that somebody who bought a Tesla 2 years ago has much more future possibilities than the Tesla bought today? There are some of the ideas there. And the other one was interesting, to me was very interesting. BMW basically said there is a semiconductor shortage. So we cannot offer all the functionality. So we give you a $500 credit. So you wanted all these electronics? No, we give you the car with without those electronics, but you know what? You don't have all these options. And you will see when you buy a car, you will see that many of the options are not available anymore. And even if you want to buy a Tesla, it's interesting. The other day, a colleague was trying to, and the delivery date was depending on the options. And I was like, what do you mean? Well, is it the case that, like, when you buy a ticket in the airline, the further away it is cheaper? And they basically say, if you buy the expensive options, it's available in 4 months. If you buy the cheap ones, it's going to be 1.5 years. Which also means managing demand. So rethinking the product and the product development is that somebody was talking about frugal innovation. Very much that concept. Absolutely. Spot on. There is another one, which is basically just eliminating the product or the service. And I'm saying that because in the hospitality industry, they found themselves with a shortage of labor. And some restaurants, and you have seen that in the news and so on, and I put that because it's very colorful, they try to use some robots to do that. If you go to some companies, they don't offer certain services, or you need, as a consumer, as a customer, you need to put more on your side. Why? Because they don't have enough. So we are rethinking the offering that we are providing to our customers and consumers because we don't have enough personnel. You can also think in Europe, there is known that some airlines are not able to fly enough lines, enough connections, because there is a shortage of pilots. So you reduce, to manage that, the offer. This is another company. This is an interesting company. This is digital. So this is a company that actually uses artificial intelligence to find out all the risk in your supply chain. So they are basically reading the whole internet news every 4 seconds and customizing that for your supply chain and telling you, oh, there is a problem in that port. This is what's going to happen. In red, you have, that line from this port to this port is going to be too busy. This one is green, this one is yellow. So basically it tries to provide you with a set of what is happening and how can you detect very fast and have transparency about what's going on in the supply chain. Why is this important? Because an early warning helps you to find solutions. It's not that they solve the problem for you, but they help you to find a solution early on. And as you know, the earlier you know the challenge that you're going to have, the more likely is that you're going to find a solution. So we are finding quite a lot. Another example is this company, PMI. They have something called DigiChain. Now, PMI is Philip Morris International. They have a new product, these IQOS, which is about heating tobacco, not burning it. They develop a almost fully digital supply chain, manufacturing chain for that. And why they did that? They said this new product, actually, by comparison to traditional cigarettes, is much more volatile. They were saying, a consumer of smoker of a cigarette is going to have the same brand for 20 years. These things that actually they are risk-reduced products and so on, consumers might change, flavor might change things in a few months. So we need to be much more agile to react. And this is what they did. They developed, we wrote a case about that at the time, you can read it. They developed a full chain that actually the main objective was to reduce the time to volume, not the time to market, the time to volume to bigger scale production from 4 months to 7 days. They use a lot of digital tools. They use a lot of different concepts. But basically the idea was, how can we become much faster, much more agile, and therefore being able to respond? And that's what many companies are now thinking about structurally. How do we change things so we are much faster in reaction? I always remember the chief supply chain officer of Unilever until last year, Mark Engel, was telling me, Carlos, if we will be able to react very, very fast, we will need even to do forecasting. We will need even to do a lot of things. But how can we go much faster? So now the issue is, and I'm emphasizing now one thing, which is a very tough one. Yes, digitalization helps, but it doesn't, the traditional one. The traditional IT systems are customer-driven, and this is embedded. So it's so embedded that if you think about an ERP system, you can think about SAP or Oracle or anyone, they start always with what is the demand that we foresee and that the consumers or the customers are going to buy. And then let's cascade that in a logical way to what do we need to do in the whole organization to supply this. That's the logic. It's called, in the case of materials, it's called MRP, Material Requirements Planning. And the idea is, tell me what I'm going to do, what you're going to sell, and then I will see how I supply the materials and so on. These systems are fantastic for that. However, if the question is the reverse one, given these supplies what I can do, they simply don't have the logic. Remember, from McDonald's, once you tell me what I'm going to sell, what is the menu exactly, I can immediately use these systems. The logic is perfect there to know what I need to do. If you're the chef and you say, this is what we have as ingredients, and try to infer what is the menu that we should offer that will satisfy consumers, and at the same time, we will be able to do it in the quantities that we expect, that software doesn't exist. So what I have seen is a lot of companies using a lot of Excel spreadsheets. And a lot, it means thousands of them. And even in small size companies, they end up doing that because it's almost impossible to answer that question. The only way is to generate some scenarios and to think, okay, if we make this, but given these semiconductors, given these and this, what I can do and what is the most profitable one? We don't have an algorithm for that yet. Many of these digital systems, they don't have it. Or more than digital, the traditional IT systems don't have it. So we are going to see an emergence of new digital solutions to help them. And the traditional ones with that logic, actually, they become a little bit of a legacy issue because we cannot use them very effectively. So another one, we're talking about the ecosystem. This, if you remember, this is the Operation Warp Speed. Let me rephrase that, it's 1 year old. Sorry, there is a comment. Eric was saying supply chain 4 integration into the industry is not going to solve it yet. Somebody, and I think that many startups are going to develop those logics in order to precisely deal with that. And I think that we'll see an emergence of digital solutions to tackle this. And then the subsequent question was, okay, are these shortages here to stay? The answer is yes. Not only because the current causes of the shortages are going to stay here, but also because as we drive to a much more sustainable supply chain configuration, we are going to use less resources. We are going to recycle more and so on. We are going to much more to the circular economy. We are going to face many more constraints. And as a consequence, we will be also already having the shortage. Just to give you one idea, in some supply chains, we have shortages of some recycling products. You want to make, if you are Coca-Cola and you want to make all of your bottles, plastic bottles, out of recycled plastic, the challenge today is there is not enough recycled plastic as a raw material to make them. So this is why we're going to face those continuously. So that's what is going to happen. So let me go now to this idea of the ecosystem. For the first time with the vaccine, we have started to see a collaboration in the ecosystem, an orchestrator, if you want. And in this particular case was what the US put in place. Somebody was, in general, was an office was created, was a retired, if I recall correctly, was somebody that used to work in the army that was in charge of that. And what he did basically put everybody together, including competitors, Pfizer and Moderna, including distributors, including facilities. They include almost everybody, transport companies. I think they didn't include the vial supplier anyway. And basically try to make sure that we have everybody there in the ecosystem to make sure that we can deliver. We will see that much more in the future, that need for wider coordination. Why this coordination was needed, it was precisely because there was a shortage of supply. If you remember, all vaccine companies were trying to make as many vaccines as possible in the shortest possible time. And that was a race against time in order to save lives. And that was why this coordination was needed. There was no ample supply and was not the stable consumption. In these situations where you need that. And these are the situations that we're going to face over the next years in many supply chains. So these were the different things that we have seen companies doing. Higher stock levels in some places. I remember some companies saying, well, Carlos, the cost of financing is so low, we can have stock levels. Cost of financing is going to go up and you may get the wrong stock in the wrong place. Looking for alternative suppliers, talk about that. Regionalization, the nearshoring trend, still will have a big part of the economy that is globalized, but we'll see more and more, I will say, regionalization. Designing the product and the service, trying to understand what is the outcome of the coordination between these are the supply constraints, this is what we can offer. Simplifying this offer to consumers, basically taking out some products. Digitalization, and we saw some companies doing very good things and some others that the traditional IT systems might be a challenge. Increasing agility, we saw the example of PMI and the collaboration across the ecosystem, the example of the vaccines. Now, what not to do? And this is what happened in Europe. You remember a European Union civil servant was threatening AstraZeneca because there was a contract. And in the contract, it says so many vaccines with these dates and these dates and these dates. At this situation, the last thing that you should do is to sue the supplier. This is what Volkswagen was talking about. We are going to sue the chip suppliers. What was the reaction of the chip supplier? Well, you know what? Let's try to not to work, or let's try to be very careful about the contract, the clauses, and so on. It's not a partnership. It's as I remember one supplier of a certain industry putting that. They said it's not. They talk about partnership, but it's actually partnership. So that's exactly what not to do. And let me provide the counter example. In the case of the vaccine, to me, it was very interesting. Israel became the world leader in vaccine. And you say, why? Well, they did exactly the opposite. They became the most attractive country, the most attractive country for the companies, for the pharma companies. Pfizer or any other pharma company, they had several challenges in deploying the vaccine. First, is there any side effect that we are not aware of because we are speeding up the process? So it would be great if we can have data about all the side effects, who is going vaccinated, why, what are the causes, what are the effects. Second, also, if by any reason there is a side effect, the damage to the company could be huge. What did the Israeli government did? They said to Pfizer, we'll provide you all the data. Privacy issues will be taken into account, but we'll provide you all the data. And second, if there is any risk, we take part of it. So of course, for Pfizer, it was an easy choice. Where are we going to get more data and therefore help us to increase the safety of the product and is less risky from an economical point of view? Israel. So they went there first. Similar thing, Tesla, semiconductors manufacturers, they will tell you that Tesla is a great customer. For most car companies, semiconductor manufacturers are not suppliers. They are suppliers or other supplier that supply to them, the tier one suppliers. So company like Volkswagen might have suppliers like Siemens, Bosch, etc. And these companies, in turn, they have semiconductor suppliers. In the case of Tesla, it's the only one that deals directly. And this is why you see there's a partnership between Tesla and Samsung. Many people will say, yeah, but Tesla is very small in terms of numbers. Yes, but they want to work together with the semiconductor manufacturers. So that's the opposite of saying confronting versus collaboration. How do we collaborate? So reminder, basically, the supply chain is the weakest link, and there is where I would like a little bit to finalize. Let me go back and to approach some of these. These are some of the things that we have seen in companies, making that more resilient. And these are some of the advice. Now, some of you might say, Carlos, these are some basics, like putting more stuff. Yes, but that's precisely what we need to do. Couple of things. There were some comments on the Zoom chat that I would like to answer. We have just 1 minute, and I would like to finalize. One of the things that is important is that some people were saying, Carlos, it's great. You broke this down to things that non-supply chain experts can understand. Let me break the news to you. Supply chain experts are having a difficult time sometimes understanding the basics. We have been so used to it that we never look at that. And I think that is one of the main points for me is that in the future, we need the different parts of the company, supply chain, sales, product development, and marketing to work together. I will include finance. We do that in something which is called the sales and operations planning process. But I think it's not enough. We will need precisely to put this in place and to understand how to manage the risks and the profitability across the whole company to work much more in sync. Something that, and I'm saying that, sounds nice, but it's costly in time and money. But I think that that is where we are going. And that's the example, the last thing I would like to end up. So even that I'm in Spanish, I want to finish on time. It's 1 o'clock. Thank you very, very much for your comments. And thank you for being with us. And I hope that we are going to have a very easy way ahead with our supply chains, and all of you will get all the products that you want. But you might be a little bit more careful about trying to understand the constraints of supply. So thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. And I hope that soon we'll see each other again, either through these technology-mediated media or face-to-face.